I lose that though? I lose my participants. There it is. Okay. Good evening, everyone. We'll get started here after we see that everyone who had registered, it looks like, is joining. And while you are watching, I will say that there is a chat section. We would like for you to use that for technical issues or questions that you may be having with the broadcast. The Q&A option that you will see, if you could post your questions for Dr. Turko there as she is giving the presentation, that will allow you to, one, see the questions that are being posted and also promote those questions or add additional detail to those questions. So you can upvote them if you like, so we can get those to be addressed first from our speaker. So while we're waiting for everyone to get on the broadcast, we'll be quiet here for a minute and you can just look at the lovely Houston Geological Society logo. And the three of us off to the side. Oh, it keeps doing that. Welcome, everyone. As you're joining, as you can see from the info that we have on here, please use the chat for operational comments or concerns. Use the Q&A feature for questions that we will be addressing following the presentation. If you see a question posed that you also like, or you want maybe a different take on that, you can upvote that question so that we know to have the speaker be sure to address that live. Anything that we can't get to, of course, obviously, Dr. Turko will have her information on here and we would be glad to put you in touch with her. This is part of the social networking that we're doing virtually. The three people that you are seeing on your video feed at the top with the Houston Geological Society logo. My name is Patty Walker. I am the Vice President of the Houston Geological Society for the 2021-2022 season. Mike Erpenbeck, our president, if he'll give us a little wave, we'll be saying some few comments at the beginning, and Dr. Molly Turko is the one that you see there, actually the bottom of the screen for me. She will be our feature speaker this evening. Oh, apparently you only see me. Okay, that is good to know.
Sometimes on these webinars, it'll flash up for whoever is speaking and then go away when the next person speaks. So I bet that's it. I bet they're seeing you since you were doing all that speaking.
That's probably true. Thank you, Brian. All right, we're going to give this just a couple more minutes. I know a lot of people are probably just getting home from work. We usually give people a few minutes after our start time to pop on.
How many do we have right now, Patty?
Let me mute myself for just a moment. Okay, I see someone that is a phone call listener. Okay, thank you very much. So this is so to Anthony, this is a webinar as we're broadcasting. So you all, so everyone, when they join, you're automatically muted and your video is off. As the host, I have the controls that can then allow people to come on. The video gets muted. Partly it's a webinar feature that is actually helping with bandwidth. And then if someone wants to be able to speak, you can raise your hand or you can let me know in the chat that you have something that you would like to say. We will ask everyone to use the Q&A feature, which you have for questions that you want for Dr. Turko. If you have operational concerns like we just did right here, which is perfect, thank you, Anthony, use the chat to let me know if you're having an issue with something as part of the Zoom webinar. By using the Q&A feature, it allows us to better follow the questions and also gives you the ability to upvote a question so that if you see something that you thought was just a really awesome question, I apologize, I have a very jumpy mouse today, that you see is a very popular question, you can upvote that and we can be sure that we have Dr. Turko address that question. Okay, annoying mouse. All right, with that, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. It looks like we have most people on. We may have a few people that join us late. Thank you everyone for attending. Sorry for the jumpy mouse. I'm going to introduce first the president of HGS, Mike Erkenbach. He's going to actually do some opening comments and walk through some of the exciting things that are happening with HGS. So Mike, are you on? Let me make sure. It says your video is on.
Yes, I'm Mike Erpenbeck, president of the Houston Geological Society. And first of all, I want to thank all of you thanks for coming. Appreciate your support of our technical program. Thanks, Dr. Turko, for making the long trip here, sort of. And Patty, thanks a lot for running our technical program as vice president. So this probably isn't your first rodeo for most of you. In case it is, or maybe you need a reminder, these technical dinners are actually society meetings. So, this may be your only chance to talk directly to a couple board members, Patty and me, for any issues or questions you might have. So feel free to speak up. I think, Patty, we decided that we do that at the very beginning and then kind of conduct the formal part of the meeting. So we can do that. So next slide here.
And you all can put that in the Q&A even right now if you have questions related just to HGS. Okay,
so
Mike.
I was expecting the slide to change. Has it changed? I didn't see it.
It has changed. Do you see it?
Okay, I probably got my PowerPoint on there. Okay, I see it now. Okay, so here's our upcoming meetings, dinners, lunches, etc. We have our lunch that's not shown here, but that occurs every month. And I don't think we had it. It was on the screen. Yeah, general lunches. Anyway, these are upcoming meetings and dinners and lunches. So we have our environmental and engineering, which we don't have a date. Oh, yes, it is October 13th. I don't know the topic on that, but it'll show on the website. So we have our international dinner, and these are all virtual. We took a stab at trying to sprinkle in a few in-person meetings, but there just didn't seem to be a lot of support just yet. So we're going to hold off on that for now, and everything's going to be virtual. So we have AAPG's Giant Fields database, speakers John Dolson, and I won't read the rest of these because you can see it on your screens, but you see that we have a encore presentation, and that is a short course. So how to use paleontology in the oil and gas industry. Very popular the last time we had it, so we're several years ago, so we decided to run it again. You can see the North American dinner and the sheriff lecture. The sheriff lecture is put on by the University of Houston in conjunction with HGS. So it's their topic and their speaker, and usually they draw a big crowd. You don't want to miss that one. Okay, Patty.
Okay, yes, and Sean Gullick, who's going to be the speaker, actually is a professor at the Jackson School of Geosciences at the University of Texas.
Golf tournament, if you're a linkster, I think we've extended the early bird pricing yet again to October 14th. So there is, and added a couple new teams. So it's still kind of filling in. So that's going to be on October 18th.
Weather should be spectacular.
Yeah. So here's the short course that I mentioned. And so any of you people that are bug people or microfossils, or I guess macrofossils too. But anyway, there's 4 hours of professional development hours associated with attending this one. Sheriff Fleisch, should. Life and death by impact, drilling for clues. Is that impact from outer space or?
Pretty sure it's about I think he's talking about, yes, some of the craters in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, okay.
So
you see that they need, we also do student posters in conjunction with this dinner, and they're looking for volunteers. So please contact the office if you have a desire to help out in that regard.
yeah, this is usually a very popular event, so it's good to register early for this.
Latin conference is coming up November 8th through 10th. And that is obviously Latin America. It's a conference we have every year in conjunction with the EAGE, European Association of Geologists and Engineers. And this year it's our turn to have it in Houston, and we've got a really solid technical program that we've got to offer on this. So go to the website and, you know, think about registering for that. It's going to be an in-person icebreaker reception, and then the rest of it is going to be online.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. Vendor corner is when we had in-person meetings. These were actually little exhibits set up on the corner of the meeting room by vendors that were promoting their services and whatnot. So imagine that. I haven't seen. Have you, Patty, seen how their presentation looks on a virtual screen?
No, not yet. We've yet to do virtual vendor corners as we are going into next year, and the board is actually talking through what our spring, basically would be January to May, technical program is looking like. We're going to be discussing different platforms and different ways to offer both vendor opportunities and a variety of speakers as well to everyone.
Okay. We do provide scholarships for students through our two foundations, one of them who offers scholarships to graduate students and the other for undergrads. And again, you can contact the office to see how to contribute to these. And these few of our schools that we've given scholarships to recently appear at the bottom. I don't see Texas Tech. That's troubling.
Nope, no tech. You got to get on them for that then. There's
Yeah,
Lamar. Sorry, I have Lamar covered up.
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Social media.
social sites or social media. So we're on the broad spectrum of sites there, as you can see, and another way to stay up with what's going on in the society.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone to make sure that you have these sites. If you're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram, that you actually follow these different links, because a lot of our activities are being broadcast quite a bit on social media. And we're finding that's actually more effective even than the traditional email chain. I know we all get a lot of email. And so being able to see these actually on some of these social sites is actually much more efficient. Okay. Okay.
So before I hand it over to Patty, I'll just remind everyone that feel free to contact us. And I would even say contact me directly. There's a phone number that's published somewhere of my personal phone number. And I like to talk on the telephone rather than trade email. So So give me a shout if you have any thoughts or concerns or any reason related to HGS business. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Mike. So, okay, can you all see me now or just my screen? Not sure that matters. So to Mike's point, if you actually visit the HGS website, all of the current board members and the directors who are also board members, all of our email and phone numbers are listed there, as well as, I think for some of us, even our social media sites. So feel free to go to those if you have questions. But let's get to the real event, which we're very honored tonight to have Dr. Molly Turko with us to talk about the impact of the Wichita Uplift on the Anadarko Basin, and actually that impact then on drilling complexity for companies that work in those areas. Dr. Turko has 13 years of experience in the oil and gas industry and is a subject matter expert in structural geology, which is awesome. So I have to tell you, when I was an undergrad, that was one of the most intimidating courses for me, was structural geology. She's had the opportunity to work in multiple basins, Anadarko, Ardmore, Delaware. You all can read on and on and on. She received both a bachelor's and a master's in geology from the University of Tulsa. Actually, that's the school that my son went to, followed by a PhD in 2019 from the University of Oklahoma, where she studied under Dr. Mitra. Of course, being an Oklahoma State grad, I did have to give her a little bit of grief about that. So we may have to do a friendly little bet for what may be the last bedlam. Her work experience includes Chesapeake, Devon, and several small operators in Tulsa. She's taught lots of courses. Some of you probably have seen some of her talks, both that she has out on YouTube and also that she's done through the AAPG structural division as well, which she actually is the vice president of the Petroleum Structure and Geomechanics division. She loves to mentor, she loves to teach. Her favorite thing though, from what she tells us, is leading structural geology field courses. I think she's probably going to talk about some of those. She's currently a team member at Applied Stratigraphics as one of their structural geology experts, and has her own consulting firm called Turko Tectonics and Structural Geology. So Molly, I'm going to turn it over to you. So I will stop sharing my screen and we will have Molly share her screen now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me see. All right. Can you see a PowerPoint with a beautiful picture of the Wichita Mountains in the background?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the great introduction and for hosting me today. So we are going to talk about the impact of the Wichita Uplift on basically structures that we see in the Anadarko Basin, the deep parts of the Anadarko Basin, as well as the shallow. And we're going to kind of briefly discuss some implications to operations and the impact that can have there. And Patty did a nice job introducing me. I do just have one quick slide. I've never presented for the HGS before, so it's an honor to be here. And I did my dissertation at OU under Dr. Mitra, and I actually did it on the Wichita Uplift. So a lot of this talk kind of comes from that work that I did there, and then relating it to a lot of the experience I've had in the oil and gas industry. And as she mentioned, I do consulting and contract work, and the company that I'm with now is called Applied Stratigraphics. We teach a lot of great field courses. So if you want to know more about the courses we offer, you can visit stratigraphyhelp.com and maybe one day go on one of our really fun field trips. So I kind of want to start by talking about why it is important to understand structures in the basin. I think in a lot of times in this world, especially with the unconventionals, people kind of overlook structure, but it's still really important. So I hope that that is a point that I can make during this talk. And then we'll get into the tectonic history of Southern Oklahoma, and then start to talk about some of the structures on the Anadarko Shelf and discuss some key concepts that can really help you with understanding that structure. So the Anadarko Basin, if you're not familiar with it, it is located here in the central part of the United States. It's actually considered a super basin. It's the 5th largest natural gas area in the US. And a little fun fact is back in the 1970s, they drilled the deepest well. It was the Bertha Rogers, and they drilled so deep that they encountered liquid sulfur that destroyed the bit. So I bet that was fun to be on the rig at that time, or not. So the Wichita Uplift sits at the southern edge of the Anadarko Basin. It trends approximately northwest, southeast, and the deepest part of the basin is just to the north of it. And in that shallows as you move to the north, and we tend to call that the shelf region. So now let's talk about the why, now that you know where the Anadarko Basin is. So why is understanding structure so vital to successful operations? Well, I enjoy a few of these quotes from various operators and reports and papers. I always love it when I read something from an engineer and they talk about faults and fractures and all that stuff. So here's one that says, when drilling highly permeable, highly fractured and depleted zones, large drilling fluid losses lead to increased operational expenses. So that mud can be very expensive. And if you hit one of those open fracture or fault networks, that can cause the company some money. Here's another fun one. So within the reservoir, the physical mechanisms contributing to well interference, those can be complex. Some of that complexity is from the matrix. However, some of that can be also from natural fractures and faults. And this is a diagram of, it's a map view. So you're looking down on it. In green is the natural fracture network. Then in blue is a horizontal well. And in red, that's the hydraulic fractures. So I know it's a little bit small, but what you'll see is this long kind of red thing. What they modeled is that when you fract into this natural fracture network, you're actually propagating that natural fracture. Well, that thing, according to their model, that propped over 2,000 feet away. So if you think about a 600-foot well spacing, you might see some interference between those wells. And then lastly, another one related to operations is, as the induced hydraulic fractures propagate, that can cause natural fractures to dilate. That can increase the fluid leak off. That can also result in shorter fractures, such as a smaller SRV. So here's kind of a diagram showing that, where we have the natural fractures and the hydraulic fractures. So in this case, the natural fracture is taking in fluids, inhibiting the growth of the hydraulic fracture, which creates shorter fracs and a smaller SRV. So I do feel that structure is something that can't be controlled. You know, we can turn a lot of knobs, but we can't really control structure. However, I do feel that it can be predicted. You know, with some skill, you have to have a good structural geologist on your team. And we know that it can heavily impact operations and develop, but you also kind of want to ask to what degree. There's some instances where structure is going to be very important and very impactable, and there's cases when it might not. But in order to answer that question, what you want to look at is your spatial variations in different aspects of structural geology to things like your drilling, your completion, and production. And you really want to make sure you understand the kinematics and the origins of those structures. You know, what type of faults are those? And you can't forget about the mechanical stratigraphy, because as you go up and down in the stratigraphic section, things can sometimes behave a little bit different. So understanding these relationships can aid in predicting the structures while mitigating and preparing for the associated risks. So what are some of the structures in the Anadarko Basin? Well, we have lots of faults. We have strike slip, normal and reverse faults, and we also have lots of fractures. So I'm probably going to throw the word kinematics. As a structural geologist, I like to throw that word around a lot. But for structural geology, kinematics is essentially the description that the path the rock took during deformation. So if we have our nice little dinosaur here, we can rotate him, we can dilate him, we can put a little bit of shear on him, or we can put a nice fault through him. And the path that he took, the way he moved, that's essentially a way to describe the kinematics. So let's talk about the tectonic history of the Anadarko Basin and then start to get in some of the kinematics of what the rocks are telling us about the tectonic history. It can pretty much be broken down into three main events. Back during the Precambrian to Cambrian, we had a failed rift that cut through that region. This resulted in the emplacement of a large igneous complex that shows up nicely on gravity and magnetic data. You can see the approximate outline of the rift through here. After that, we had post-rift subsidence. During that time, we had pretty thick carbonate deposition into that rift. And then during the Pennsylvanian, we had what I'll refer to as the Pennsylvanian orogeny, and that led to the structural inversion of the rift. And then as time goes on, things get eroded. And now what we see at the surface is some of those igneous rocks, which make up the Wichita Mountains. So the structural styles of the Pennsylvanian orogeny have been fairly controversial over the decades. Some people propose you have simple compression and thrust faults. Others propose large scale strike slip with large pop-ups, or maybe a component of both with transpression. Let's do a quick overview of the Pennsylvanian orogeny. So just to get you oriented, here's Oklahoma in the center of the map. The Wichita Uplift is located down here in southwestern Oklahoma. During this time, we also had the uplift of the ancestral Rocky Mountains. Notice that these old mountains, they tend to trend northwest, southeast. Well, traditionally, these uplifts are attributed to the collision of North America with Africa/South America. That resulted in the Ouachita Thrust Fault, well, the Appalachia-Ouachita Marathon Thrust Fault. However, much of the deformation along that front is considered thin skin, especially up here in Oklahoma. And some of the more recent literature has actually proposed that these uplifts were a result of interplate tectonics along the western and southwestern margins of North America, and that it was the interactions between these margins that actually led to a northeast directed stress versus a northwest directed stress. So that's just something to keep in mind. That would essentially represent our paleo stress history, which, as you'll see, can be very important for predicting structure and kinematics. So I've done quite a bit of work on the Wichita Uplift, and I have several publications that are out. I'm happy to send you PDFs of any of those if you're interested. Just let me know. But the study area was kind of pretty much located here within this red rectangle. And one of the things that we did with our data, we had quite a bit of 2D and 3D seismic along with all the well data, proprietary gravity, some magnetic data, and surface geology. We actually constructed a regional structure map at the Arbuckle level. The Arbuckle sits pretty much right on top of the basement, so it represents some very deep structures. And in this map, this is a structure map on the Arbuckle, but where you see those white areas, that's where the Arbuckle has been eroded on top of the Wichita Uplift. So the uplift trends approximately northwest, southeast, and in some of the deepest parts of the Anadarko Basin are shown out here in this deep purple color. Now there's a bunch of faults that are also on here, so we'll come back to this little red rectangle, or more like a square. We'll come in and zoom into this square and talk about those faults in a second. But before we go, I do want to show you one regional seismic line and kind of briefly discuss that. So we'll look here at cross section A, which extends over the Wichita Uplift, this Ouachita Valley Fault, as well as the Carter-Knox anticline, which is an oil and gas field. So the Wichita Mountain Fault is this large thrust fault that you see here. And that is one of the main fault systems primarily responsible for the Wichita Uplift.
Molly, it hasn't well, there it goes.
Oh,
There's
so,
no change.
okay.
Yeah.
Slight delay. That's okay. I'll keep that in mind. So, okay, so before I explain that, here on the right side is actually a stratigraphic chart of the Southern Anadarko Basin, and it can be broken into 3 mechanical packages. Down here, we have the basement rock, that's our Precambrian granites, as well as that Cambrian igneous complex. Above there, we have fairly thick carbonates, that represents our pre-Pennsylvanian section. And then above there, we have thin bedded clastics, and that represents our Pennsylvanian age section. And the whole area is essentially truncated by an unconformity at the base of the Permian. So in some of these seismic lines, you'll see a yellow dashed line that essentially represents the base of the Permian. We've also identified 2 detachments, one near the base of the Springer Shale, which is shown kind of right here in the central part. This divides those thin bedded clastics from the thick bedded carbonates. And within the study area, it's a fairly thick shale, and it acts as a detachment near the base. We've identified a second detachment near the base of the Arbuckle as well. It's probably somewhere on top of the basement, but likely within the Arbuckle section. So in this cross section, we have the Wichita Mountain Fault, and that is the main fault responsible for the Wichita Uplift. As this fault progressed upwards towards the surface, it tends to flatten here along the base of the Springer Shale. That's where you see kind of this brownish color. And as that fault flattened, that transferred slip into the Anadarko Basin along that detachment. And that slip was actually transferred into structures in the basin. So one of those is the Carter-Knox anticline. So we classify that as a faulted detachment fold within the Pennsylvanian age section. And a faulted detachment fold is simply a faulted fold where you have a fair amount of folding before the faulting. In contrast to that would be like a fault propagation fold, where the faulting is primarily responsible for the folding that's developed. So in some of the reconstructions, we felt like we see a fair amount of folding before you actually start faulting. This faulted detachment fold overlies a deeper fault-related fold, and that can be related to a detachment at the base of the Arbuckle that once again can link back into the frontal fault to the Wichita Uplift. Here in the central part of the cross section is the Ouachita Valley Fault. We classify this as a rather late stage strike slip fault. So in the basement, you'll see several normal faults over here under Carter-Knox. We believe those are remnant from the rifting phase, and that those could have either become reactivated or controlled the location of the structures above. In the case of the Ouachita Valley Fault, that was one of our reactivated faults, and it reactivated with a sense of left lateral strike slip. As that became activated, that cut up through the section, and that then cut what was likely another faulted detachment fold, cut up through that faulted detachment fold, and then allowed a graben to form near the upper tip. That graben is filled with Virgilian sediment, which is very late Pennsylvanian. So we believe the timing on that strike slip could have been during the later parts of the Pennsylvanian. So I can talk more on the Ouachita Valley Fault. I do have that coming up in a couple slides. Let's go back to that structure map in the Southeast Anadarko Basin. So this blue dashed line, that's about where we had our 3D seismic coverage. And you'll see several faults in there, and I will highlight those for you. What you'll notice is there's 2 general trends. Some of these trend a little bit more northwest, southeast, and 2 of them trend a little bit more east-west. This northern one, that's the cement fault, also associated with the cement anticline located kind of in here where you see that little anticline structure. And then the second more east-west fault is the Ouachita Valley Fault, that one that I just mentioned. and that also trends to the southeast part of the Anadarko Basin. So there are a lot of structures down here. Each of those structures is pretty much related to a conventional oil and gas field. A lot of these consist of anticlinal structures. So I'll do a very quick summary of the structures that we see, and I will divide these into structures that are more northwest southeast oriented and structures that are a little bit more east-west oriented. So in these top three panels, these are all northwest southeast oriented structures. Here's the Carter-Knox field that we just looked at. And if you remember, we classified this as a faulted detachment fold within the thin bedded clastics that were Pennsylvanian in age. That then overlies a deeper fault related fold. The Chickasha anticline and the Cruce anticline could both be classified the same way, faulted detachment folds that overlie deeper fault related folds. And each of these shows primarily thrust faulting throughout all the deformation history, and they're all pretty much northwest southeast structures. Now these bottom three panels, these represent cross sections over the east-west oriented structures. So this left one is a cross section over the cement field, and we believe this could be classified pretty much just the same as Carter-Knox. You have a faulted detachment fold that overlies a deeper fault related fold. However, you do have the cement fault that's cutting up through this section. So we believe the cement fault is a late stage strike slip fault. And as that cut through this section, that allowed a graben to cut the crest of that anticline. That graben is filled with Virgilian age sediment. So once again, indicating very late Pennsylvanian movement on that east-west system. This cross section is a few miles to the east, and it also extends over that same cement fault, but in this case, we're outside of the folded cement anticline. What you'll notice is that the stratigraphy across here is relatively uniform. In this case, we're looking at 2 strike slip faults in the basement. And this yellow dashed line is an unconformity at the base of the Permian. And once again, what we see is that the graben structure is filled with Virgilian age sediment, indicating the timing of that strike slip movement. So we see very late strike slip movement, in this case associated with a little bit of maybe a pull apart or a graben structure, helping us to really kind of tie down the timing on that fault system. This cross section here, this is my favorite cross section. So let's zoom in on this and I'll show you where that is on the map. So you're looking at 2 cross sections now. This is the one I just shown. Both of these are fairly close together and they both extend over the Wichita Valley Fault. Now I feel like this cross section here on the left kind of tells the whole story. And what we see is pretty significant folding and faulting within the pre-Pennsylvanian section, as well as within the Moroan and the Atokan as well. So during the early parts of the Pennsylvanian. So there's an unconformity in here. That's the base of the Des Moines, so about the middle pin. Below that unconformity, that's where you see pretty significant folding and faulting. Now above that Des Moines, well, within the Des Moines, you see fairly gentle folding, definitely not as drastic as what we see below. And then as you get above there, we have our Missourian. So that's that purple horizon in here. And above that is the Virgilian. So both the Virgilian and the Missourian are essentially flat over this structure, except both of those become cut by this near vertical Wichita Valley Fault. Now here on the right side, this folded structure that you're seeing here, this is simply the southeast end of the Carter-Knox anticline. So you can kind of ignore some of this here on the right more or less, but what we do see is a normal fault, and we know that because we have a missing section in this well here. We see a normal fault that links down into this Wichita Valley Fault system. This yellow dashed line is the unconformity at the base of the Pennsylvanian. So what we see in here is that Much of our growth section is Virgilian in age. We might have a little bit during the Missourian as well. But what that's telling us is that the timing of that graben would have been during the very late parts of the Pennsylvanian. Now, if we move to the right, if we move just outside of the folded Doyle structure, we get a pretty good idea of that Wichita Valley Fault. And once again, you can see this large growth section in here. Much of that, well, pretty much all of that is Virgilian in age, maybe a tiny bit in the Missourian as well. So once again, we see late stage strike slip during the late parts of the Pennsylvanian. That allowed for some of these grabens to form, indicating the timing. Now, just kinematically speaking, we classify the Wichita Valley Fault as a left lateral strike slip fault. And where both of these cross sections lie, that's where that fault takes a bit of a left step. So when you get a left step along the left lateral strike slip fault, that can result in a pull apart. So we believe this represents a little pull apart basin. Now, if you get a right step, that would result in a pop up. So if you continue to the right, you'll eventually get to the Arbuckle Mountains. So possible that some of these popped up fields here in the western part of the Arbuckle Uplift are a result of maybe moving back to the right. So I believe this cross section here on the left essentially tells the whole story. And if we think about transpersonal models, what they show us is that the style of deformation, whether that's thrust faulting or strike slip, is going to be determined by the angle of convergence, where the angle of convergence is the angle between the maximum horizontal stress and the orientation of a pre-existing fault. Where you get a high angle of convergence, you tend to get more thrust faulting. Where you get a low angle of convergence, you tend to get more strike slip faulting. So what we believe is during the early parts of the Pennsylvanian, maximum horizontal stress was oriented more or less northeast, southwest. That allowed for contractional deformation on both the east-west and the northwest-southeast. But by the time we get to the late Pennsylvanian, that stress rotated to become a little bit more east-northeast. That allowed for contractional deformation to continue on the northwest-southeast structures, whereas the more east-west oriented structures were now optimally oriented for a bit of strike slip deformation. So with that in mind, that led us to construct a tectonic model for the region. And that tectonic model is simply a block model. It's constructed at the basement level, so you're not going to see those thin skin structures. But this is a hypothetical example of what that could have looked like at the end of the rifting phase. This area in here would represent the Wichita Mountains, where they essentially sit today. And then over here, some complexities associated with the Arbuckle Uplift. During the early Pennsylvanian, when your maximum stress was oriented northeast-southwest, that allowed for the structural inversion of that rift and a lot of significant thrust faulting. And by the time you get to the late Pennsylvanian, that resulted in continued thrust faulting on the northwest-southeast structures, whereas the more east-west structures were allowed to undergo some degree of strike slip faulting. So that's kind of like a summary of part one. That's kind of big picture tectonics and how we see the paleo stresses and how the Wichita Uplift moved throughout the Pennsylvanian, which is going to significantly impact structures in the basin. So I'm probably going to skip summarizing all of this. Hopefully you remember everything I said in those last few minutes, but I want to go ahead and skip forward and start talking about structures in the Anadarko Basin and shelf region. So in this case, I'm referring to structures north of the Wichita Uplift, outside of the deformation caused by folding and thrusting. So many of these structures in the basin consist of high angle faults. These tend to contain a component of strike slip. I've seen cases where we see a little bit of normal slip with that, as well as reverse. They're primarily oriented northeast, southwest, a few east-west faults in there as well. But they're usually a lot more subtle than the structures we see in the southern part of the basin. It's very common for operators to take their 3D seismic data and accentuate the structure by using seismic attributes. So here's a nice seismic line. Thank you to TGS for putting that out. But notice I have approximately 4 times vertical exaggeration. So shrink this down 4 times, and it would be pretty hard to see this fault coming through here where you can see some of these deeper folded beds. The origin, it's always important to consider the origin because that can be, well, the origin of things, they can become reactivated throughout time. So whenever you're looking at a structure, think about the timing and the origin of that. So a lot of these likely originated during our Pennsylvanian tectonics. However, you could have some deep faults that originated during basin subsidence, whether that was subsidence during the rifting phase or as the Foreland Anadarko Basin developed. And here in Oklahoma, we even have some Proterozoic faults that became reactivated in the Pennsylvanian. So thinking about Proterozoic tectonics can then become important. And of course, reactivation of any of these structures above is going to be key as well. So these are some of the key concepts for understanding those structures. We want to make sure we understand our stress regimes as well as our fault models. So I'll touch on this here in a second. And as we saw from the first part of this talk, we want to consider models of transpression and transtension, especially if we're reactivating structures. What's the orientation of that to our maximum horizontal stress as that's becoming reactivated? Concepts of strike slip, I won't get into too many details, but that's going to be important to know. And also your tectonic history in those paleo stress models. And then I'll briefly talk about this concept of penetrative strain, which is pretty much going to be important for any foreland basin. So when we start thinking about stress regimes, we have to think about paleo stress regimes versus modern stress regimes. And these are essentially made up of 3 magnitudes and 3 directions. We think about our 3 principal magnitudes. You're going to have a maximum, a minimum, and an intermediate. And in each of those are going to have a direction. In this case, it's very common to consider these vertical and then 2 horizontal stresses. So if you have this cube of rock here and you apply these stresses to it, basically the magnitude of those vectors is going to determine the stress regime. So if you're in a normal faulting stress regime, that simply means that your maximum stress is vertical. So as that pushes on the rock, that's going to allow for normal faults to develop. Normal faults will trend parallel with your intermediate stress, and they will open in the direction of your minimum stress because that's your minimum stress. That's the easiest way it's going to open. And if you're in a reverse faulting regime, now your minimum stress is vertical. So that's why it's going to be easiest to kind of overcome that overburden and lift that, creating reverse faults and folding. If you're in a strike slip regime, your intermediate stress is your overburden and your minimum is horizontal. So if you're pushing on the rocks, it's going to be easiest to open horizontally versus moving it laterally. And each of these stresses can be related to the orientation of the faults. Notice that these faults like to form at approximately 30 degrees to the orientation of S1. So with that in mind, that's a very brief introduction to Andersonian fault models, but they can be really helpful if you understand your paleo stress history just a little bit, and it can actually help to make things a bit predictable. So another key thing to know are some kinematics of strike slip, and I could spend 3 hours going through the kinematics of strike slips, but I'm probably not going to do that. But one of my favorite tools are these classic strain ellipses. So basically what you're doing as you're pushing on this, think about it as a circle, and now you've pushed on it and it's become a nice ellipse. This tells us the orientation of where we expect our normal faults to develop versus our reverse faults. Notice the normal faults are parallel, reverse faults are perpendicular. And then within here too, this tells us the predicted orientations of right lateral strike slip faults versus left lateral strike slip faults. Sometimes we call these our Rydell shears or anti-Rydells. And then a nice little diagram of a strike slip fault and some of the key things like horsetail splays. It's very common to see your Rydell shears. I don't see the anti-Rydells as common, but definitely it's very common to see Rydell shear geometries. And lastly, there's this concept of penetrative strain. So penetrative strain, that constitutes the proportion of the total shortening across an origin that is not accommodated by the development of macro scale structures such as fold and thrust belts. So if you take this clay cake model and you're looking down on it in map view, if you compress it from the north, what you'll find is that within here, there's a region where you have fold and thrust deformation. So if I were to draw a cross section over that, you'd see lots of nice thrust faults, lots of nice folding. And then there's a region in front of there where these strain ellipses are ever so slightly deformed, but you don't see thrust faults and you don't see the folding. And then if you continue out in front of there, you'll eventually see strain ellipses that are undeformed. Well, when they're undeformed, that simply goes back to a normal faulting regime where our maximum stress is vertical. But between there, that would essentially represent an area where we have strong lateral compression, but not quite high enough to uplift that overburden, making thrust faults or folds. That represents our strike slip regime out in front of this fold and thrust belt. So I believe that could very well be an explanation for a lot of the thrust faulting that we see out in front of the Wichita Uplift. So let's take a look at some structures in the Anadarko Basin and see if that holds true. So here's a study area in the central part of the basin. And what we see is a north-south fault system through here. This is a cross section over that. You can see another uninterpreted one here. And these tend to be very vertical. Even though this is likely has some vertical exaggeration to it, these faults still appear to be vertical. Now within this study, they also ran some seismic attributes. So what you see along this north-south fault system are those nice Rydell shears. Those likely have a little bit of normal slip on those, allowing those to kind of show up in that seismic data. And if I were to throw on my handy dandy strain ellipse, what I would see is that this actually supports an interpretation for a northeast directed stress. If you have a northeast directed stress, that allows for your normal fault, or that allows for your strike slip faults to form more or less like this in this orientation, more or less north-south, along with your Rydell shears to be at a small angle to that. So this interpretation in the central part of the basin, it supports the idea of a northeast directed stress with that associated strike slip deformation. Here's another nice article very close to the Nemaha fault. The Nemaha fault system runs north-south in the basin. You can see that here in the seismic data. But once again, you see that north-south fault and you see that northeast-southwest trend. This is just simply looking down on that in map view. But once again, if I throw one of these little strain ellipses on there, that supports an orientation for northeast directed stress during the timing of that deformation. And this is just one more quick example from the northern part of the Anadarko Basin. This is a bit vertically exaggerated, but it does a nice job kind of showing a little pop-up structure. And although I don't have the map view of this 3D seismic, what I do know is that whenever we get into this fault system, you're actually looking at one of these little contractional steps along there. And that contractional step is what's creating that little pop-up structure. So as I mentioned, figuring out the origin of these structures can be very important. You know, a lot of these are going to be related to your Pennsylvania tectonics. So using those strain ellipses and that paleo stress history, that sets up something predictable. That sets up the orientation that we expect, left lateral faulting versus right lateral faulting, and even normal faults developing in the basin. But you have to also consider the reactivation of pre-existing structures, whether those are a result of basin subsidence and flexure, or even some Proterozoic faults. So I wanted to just throw a few indicators out there that a structure has been reactivated. If you see a structure in your basin and its orientation is a bit unexpected for the stress regime and expected structural styles, you might consider that you're looking at a reactivated structure and then start thinking about the origin of that. If you have the sedimentary section there, you can start to identify your pre, syn, and post kinematic packages. That can tell you the timing of when that moved. And then I always like to throw out there, you know, use those transpersonal models as a guide. That was really helpful for Southern Oklahoma in trying to figure out whether I should expect strike slip faulting versus thrust faulting. So some additional studies that you can do is look at the mechanical stratigraphy. So rocks can behave differently under stress. Sometimes you get a nice brittle rock and you apply a stress to it and it just wants to fracture and break. Or if you have something a bit more shale or salt rich, it might want to do a little bending before it breaks. Here's a nice example in a core. We have a nice fat fracture. But once it hits that shale rich zone, that clay rich zone, it pretty much dies out. You can also do several different fracture studies. You can look at your fractures in your core, your image logs, and your outcrop, and try to do multiple fracture studies. You know, you don't just want to have a one well wonder. You want to make sure you have multiple cores that you're looking at, maybe multiple image logs in the right locations, and try to relate that stuff spatially to either your 3D seismic data and maybe attributes that you're mapping, or your structure maps, or even things like lithologic maps. If you're mapping a carbonate, you know, does your carbonate become a bit more clay rich and you see a decrease in fracture intensity, or can the opposite thing happen? Because spatial relationships are going to be very important to things operationally. You know, if you start to see mud losses, could that possibly be related to fracturing or faulting? We talked about those frac hits, or that well connectivity or well interference. Any type of completion or production data you have, I like to use a lot of those initial shut-in pressures because you get a lot of points along a well. And then if you know that well is crossing a fault, I always try to look for those little subtle changes. But basically, understanding these relationships can aid in predicting structures while also mitigating and preparing for the associated risks. And I had a nice little diagram that I put together that I kind of wanted to break down, but I don't want to get into too many details. But basically what I'm showing is you have two right lateral strike slip faults. These take a right step. And along these strike slip faults, you have a little tensional quadrant, which would be here. It should be colored red. I don't know if the red didn't come through. And you also have these little compressional quadrants. So these green dots in the background, that essentially represents production from your well. So let's say you're drilling wells along and all of a sudden you have one well that has great production. Well, that's probably because you hit one of these horsetail splays, one of these fracture zones off of that strike slip fault. And then you come in and drill a child well and it's not very good production. Well, maybe that's because you've depleted that zone already because of that fracture system in that parent well. And then some of these green wells have a red outline, and that would represent a well with mud loss. So once again, if you're drilling in one of these little fractured areas, these horsetail splays, that could cause some mud loss due to that fracture zone. But I do believe that kinematics are really going to be key to understanding the structures on the shelf. And those structures are going to be really important. They can act as traps or migration pathways. You can even have geologic risk. You know, those faults can breach your seals or even lead to reservoir compartmentalization. And you also have to consider operational risks such as mud loss or well connectivity. But one of the things that I noticed is that in the Anadarko shelf, there's a lot of subtle structures. And sometimes we might see a little anomalous pod of production. You know, you can see some little greens in here. But that little pod of production might not be related to porosity or facies, and it might seem anomalous. And I remember there was one case in particular. And once we really kind of got into the subtle details of the 3D, you could barely see it, but there was a very small normal fault. So what was happening as those oils were migrating up and out of the basin, it hit this small normal fault, and you were creating a trap on that down drop side. And those few wells that were down there, they had great production. So that was telling us that that small fault, although it was very subtle, was actually acting as a trap. And you would have never known that by looking at well data alone or porosity or any of those things. So to summarize, structure can play a huge role impacting operations and development. Structure can sometimes be positive or negative, but in order to really understand the impact, proper studies must be conducted. You really want to understand your spatial variations in structure, but you really want to understand the kinematics of those structures. Are you looking at strike slip faults, which tend to be a bit more leaky, or reverse faults, which tend to be a little bit less leaky? Make sure you understand your mechanical stratigraphy. And then also keep in mind the additional risks related to structural geometry, things that can really impact your reservoir seal or compartmentalization or any type of geohazards. So tectonic studies are going to be vital to understanding structures in the basin. Think about those paleo stress histories and how that relates to the kinematics. So here in the Anadarko Basin, we had a failed rift followed by thermal subsidence. Then we had the Pennsylvania orogeny and that Wichita Uplift. We saw a slight rotation in our paleo stresses. We believe we saw evidence for that based on some of those studies. And in thinking about the concept of penetrative strain and how that could have allowed for strike slip deformation out in front of the Wichita Uplift into the proper parts of the Anadarko Basin. So with that, I would like to thank you all, and I am open to questions. I know it's already 7 o'clock, but I have some time.
That's all right, Molly. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Yes, we do have a couple of questions, and actually, as I read off these questions, Barbara had the first one. I'm going to unmute Barbara, and hopefully Barbara is now unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yep, there you are, Barbara.
Molly, very good, very interesting. And it was good to relive some of my days from the Wichita Uplift and looking at that from college days. When I was mapping subsurface in the Ardmore Basin, we would encounter what we called flower structures. And is that a passé term? Because it's really strike slip and transpressional or transtensional, depending on whether you're looking at a pop-up or a down drop block. So is that term out of vogue now?
No, I don't think it is. I think it can go by many names. I've heard of the flower structures, positive, negative, releasing or restraining bends, pop-ups, pull aparts, transpression, transtension. I always try to think about, if I'm going to use a word, how can I define it? But I think those terms are still great, and they still give you the visual of the pop up or the pull apart, especially. I know exactly what you mean in the Ardmore Basin, but yeah, they're not old terms. I think those are still great terms.
Oh, good. I don't feel so old now.
Okay, Brian Bottoms had the next question, and I've actually unmuted you, Brian, if you want to ask your question. Is Brian still there? Okay, well, I will ask Brian's question.
Okay.
So Molly, Brian asked, he said, I'm curious if you've been, oh, sorry, has no mic. Okay, all right, I will ask your question. He says, I'm curious if you've been keeping up with the activity in the Marietta Basin and the anomalously low GORs observed there when compared to similar depths in the Anadarko and the Ardmore. I've been curious as to what could allow for such liquids-rich production given the great depths that some of these Woodford wells are being drilled. Some are greater than 17K TBD. One idea I've seen floated is that lower basement heat flow could be attributed to a different basement lithology underneath the Marietta and decreasing maturity in the Woodford. It does seem to be on strike with the Wichita, so maybe there's some truth to that, but just curious if you've seen anything that corroborates that theory.
Interesting. I'm not super familiar with it. I'm familiar with the structure in the Marietta Basin, but it's been a long time since I've actually looked at the GORs or anything like that. It is possible that the heat flow is different due to maybe different basement type is one idea. And the other thought, and this is kind of out there and a little bit arm wavy, but it's possible that the Wichita Uplift, so when we think about it, we think about a deep graben that was the deepest part of the basin, and then it was structurally inverted and popped up. But in reality, the deepest part of the basin was likely where the deepest parts of the Anadarko Basin are now. So it's very possible the Wichita Uplift, even going down into the Anadarko Basin, were never as buried quite as deep initially. That you kind of have an asymmetric basin that was never buried quite as deep as the deepest parts of the Anadarko and even Ardmore Basin. So that was always shallow. But in a map, I spatially, I'm not sure where you're talking to. 17,000 still sounds very deep. But it is possible either the lithology of the granite or maybe just structurally those areas were never actually as deep as some of the parts in the Anadarko Basin before there was slight uplift. Curious though.
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of arm wavy. There's all kinds of speculation. We could, because it's also a time temperature relationship, right?
That's true.
When exactly did it go down? How long have you been at that heat flow? So lots of different things. So you have one more question. I appreciate everybody kind of hanging on. We have one more question from Abbas. Abbas, if you have a mic, would you like to ask your question or I can ask it for you? Oh.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, you were showing some of the truss faults on the seismic data that you studied. Did you see any magmatic intrusions from the basement in those areas?
I think I do. I don't see it in the seismic data. Because I guess it would probably be a little bit too deep or difficult to see. But I definitely think I see some of that in the high resolution magnetic data. So the USGS did a survey in 2017 and that data is publicly available. There was an OSU student, Brandon Chase, who put that out there in his thesis, and I've also have his maps in my dissertation, and I'd be happy to send you those. But we do see some magnetic bodies that follow those fault trends. And what I think that is implying is that you had the paleo rift faults. You likely had some sort of intrusion into those as those were active. And now those have been uplifted. So we're seeing those linear magnetic bodies along those known faults. And I think those very well could be due to magma intruding those faults. but I haven't seen like a smoking gun in any of the seismic data. And most of the seismic data that overlies the high resolution magnetic data are the old 2D lines. A lot of where the 3D sits is in the deeper parts of the basin, and it's just so hard to see down there. But I think that's very possible that could be happening at depths.
And Molly, I actually had one question. I realized as the host, I actually can't type a question in, which is a little frustrating. But so is there a dominant structural style that seems to be associated with either the highest number of oil and gas fields or some of the larger fields?
If you're in the southern part of the Anadarko Basin and you're looking at your conventional fields, that would be like the anticlinal structures, definitely. That's dominant down there. On the shelf in the Anadarko Basin, I think a lot of that is going to be driven less by structure, more by stratigraphy, maybe more by the unconventional things, but then they're impacted by the structure. But the structures aren't always acting as like a trap. They're more probably acting as a migration pathway than a trap. But definitely, you know, I kind of questioned the strike slip story for many years. But after studying it for years and seeing the evidence for it, I guess I do think there is some strike slip quite a bit. I don't think it's like hundreds of kilometers or massive amounts. I think it's small, and it doesn't take much movement on a fault to create that. You know, you can have a strike slip fault with all your kinematic indicators. It doesn't take a ton of slip to create that.
Yeah.
But I do think probably in the basin part, probably a lot of that can be attributed to strike slip.
Cool. Okay. Well, I know we've gone a little long. I appreciate everybody hanging on. Molly, thank you so much. Oh, if you will stop sharing for the moment, your screen. And I want to thank everybody. Molly, thank you very much for what was a very, very interesting talk. Of course, anyone, if you have follow-up questions that you didn't get answered, or you would like some additional information from Dr. Turko, or you're interested in the work that she does for stratigraphics, applied stratigraphics, and also for her consulting company, you can contact her directly. We will have her information via HGS as well, so you can always get in touch with us, and we'd be willing to share her content with you as well. So thank you again so much, and we look forward to seeing everyone back. The next talk we have coming up actually will be our North America, the international dinner on the 18th. So go to the website, register for those events, and thank you all very much for an enjoyable evening.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank
Dr.
you,
Turko.
guys. Thank you so much. And I enjoy the comments coming through the chat. Thank you guys very much.
All right, I am going to end the webinar session now.
All right. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.